You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Devil's Advocates, the show where we like to debate topics that are on the mind of a lot of the comic book community. And as I've sat in my home the last few days with no running water to my shower and no ability to get clean, I've had plenty of time to think about things that are dirty, ugly, or unsightly. And one of those things that comes up quite a bit is comic book art. And you see this happen time and time again, where a comic book artist will come out with a piece and the entire comic book community starts talking about it. Most recently, probably the best example is a Frank Miller Wolverine cover that got everybody talking about whether or not it was up to par with his work. And it just brings up all these interesting topics, like, is art subjective, or can we really quantify certain artists as being good or bad? Do we need to take into account people's styles and how stylistic choices can really alter those things? And more importantly, ask ourselves, at what point do we kind of go after an artist for something that we view as a subpar product, or do we just kind of let it be for who it wants to buy it? Let the people decide with their dollars. And these are the kind of questions we want to get into tonight on Devil's Advocates as we talk about good artists gone bad. And we're back in. We're joined by my co-host, Kyle, producer Kyle, over there on that side of the screen. How's it going, Kyle?
Not bad. I was, you were talking about good artists gone bad, and all of a sudden I'm hearing that song. Good Lovin' Gone Bad.
Oh,
and just going, I wonder what would happen if I wrote a parody song and it was all about good artists gone bad and why they're all Rob Liefeld.
I have a feeling you'd take over TikTok if you did that, if you made it under a minute.
Oh, I got to work. I gotta go. I got a different project I gotta do.
I mean, these feet were made for drawn, and that's just what they're gonna do when Rob Liefeld doesn't draw the feet for you.
No, because these feet were made for drawn, and that's just what they'll do. That's why Frank Miller Wolverine looks like something I saw in one of those serial killer movies.
Yeah, and you guys probably saw it in the thumbnail. That's one of those drawings that really kind of inspired this show, because it really did capture a lot of the comic book community's ire for about a week there. But before we do dive into the topic, we as we get into talking the show, we tend to say hi less and less as people drop in. But real fast, we do have Collector P in the house. Hello. We have K-Pop Junkie holding it down. We really appreciate the support. And of course, we've got Kenneth Bird. We do appreciate you guys popping in the chat. We love bouncing off of your comments. So keep those going in the chat as you want to share your opinions about good artists gone bad. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by good artists gone bad? Hold on loosely. So
the pencil loosely, and you'll still draw better than some of these people.
Right. The way that I think about it, and we will talk about just artists that are sort of derisive in general as well. But the real heart of the topic for me is artists that were once well loved, widely loved, and to the point where their art sold books. And you could definitely put Rob Liefeld as probably the poster boy for that particular type of artist, right? Like his art, it was drove, New Mutants, it drove X-Force and all the stuff that he did at Image, of course. And now he's a meme in the comic book community for, the crazy Captain America that I also put on the thumbnail, chess, and the pouches, of course, but also the unwillingness to draw feet or recycling poses or those sorts of criticisms.
Literally stealing from yourself.
And if, it takes us down an interesting road where you can talk about artists swiping and you can kind of go down that road too. But just focusing on artists that were popular, regardless of what people thought about the techniques they used or any of that kind of stuff, they sold books. And now they're in this category where we really treat them as a joke in a lot of cases or a punchline. But at the same time, those artists still remain popular. They still get work. Rob Liefeld is still doing variant covers for Marvel, and those covers still sell. And you think of other artists that kind of fit in this category. I'd say John Romita Jr. is another artist that we can talk about as well. As his work, what I'll say about John Romita Jr., he seems to really be able to hit a deadline, and that is important.
Fight you on this in a big way.
Okay.
But we'll come back around to that.
100%. And that's the beauty of this, is we do get to share our different opinions. I think that one thing we have to mention at the top of the show, at least I feel like I need to mention at the top of the show, is just how subjective art can be. And we're talking about real artists, and there's a chance that, one of them might be viewing the stream, or you might be an artist that is watching the stream that you've had some of your work critiqued, and it is maybe kind of a trigger for you or something like that. Look, I understand that art is extremely subjective, and that even art that I find to be of poor quality or not up to the snuff of an artist that, what they've produced in the past, there's a really good chance that there are people out there that like that art, and that's just baked into this conversation. So we're going to speak in generalities a lot when it comes to the quality of the art and what people say about the art, but by no means does that mean that artist is not capable of being a good artist, or again, we mentioned deadlines earlier. Could be things like deadlines. We can talk about some of the factors that cause that stuff, those shifts in change. So,
and again, the other thing I'll say is this, and I can't say it enough, is that if we're bringing you up, it's because we expect more. If, I would never say, why this person's a bad artist, why are they popular, when they are in fact a bad artist.
Yeah.
Who was really popular, who wasn't a great artist? Stan Lee. You ever see the Spider-Man heads he drew on things? Come on now.
Yeah.
That's the other big caveat, right? It's like the Razzies.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason you're on the list is because we know, there's a certain level of expectations. And at the same time, previous work or work afterwards that has been like, hey, this is different and better.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So one thing I'd love for people to do, we're going to talk for a few more minutes here. Well, we're going to talk for a lot longer than a few more minutes. But as we're talking right now, why don't we go ahead and drop in some artists in chat? Again, not calling them out, but just drop in some artists that you think may fit into this kind of category of artists that is produced kind of infamously subpar work for what they're normally capable of, and or artists that you think maybe have a very divisive style for people as well.
Right. So the joke I made when we brought this up, and it falls into that same category, is someone like Peach Momoko, who, it is what it is. Whether you like it or not is the decision you have to make. And some people call that good and some people call that bad, but it's not, definitively one or the other.
Well, and it's really interesting you say Peach Momoko, because for me, that immediately actually kind of triggers a thought, because Peach Momoko is somebody who I would say is a victim, or maybe of their own circumstances in some regards, of having to do a ton of covers. And for how many covers, at the height of when she was working for Marvel, for example, the number of covers she was doing every month and the quality she was able to turn out, it does two things. The first thing is it showed that if she had more time to work on a piece or was able to devote more effort to it, I think it was infinitely better. The other thing it showed is that, doing all those covers at once, by the flip side of that, can maybe kind of produce a more simple image that wasn't as highly regarded by the fan bases, I would say. So she's somebody who, there are a few Peach Momoko covers that I think are fantastic. And there are a bunch of Peach Momoko covers that I think are very samey. They're just kind of the same style of, almost portrait headshot, bust kind of look with maybe some style design right behind it. And you know what? People could love every single one of those covers and want to buy every single one of those variants, and that's totally fine. But I think a lot of people kind of felt like there was maybe a little bit of burnout from being so overexposed to her covers that were that style.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's another one I will fight you on. But I will say this, and this is why the question, does Frank Miller get a pass for being a legend, or can we call him out for his subpar art these days? I don't think Frank Miller's art these days is subpar. I think it's exactly what Frank Miller has always done. I think the problem is that more and more Frank Miller is plying his trade to things he maybe ought not to. I think it, in a big way, some of these books that they're doing for Frank Miller Presents, if Frank was drawing them, wouldn't be good, because Frank can't draw that stuff. But I think because Frank Miller's a legend, people always want him to draw things he shouldn't be drawing. Wolverine is a character that doesn't live in the shadows. If something's not in 3/4 or 5/8 shadow, Frank Miller can't draw it. So it's, why use him on things that don't match that, right?
Well, I completely agree about the shadow, the darkness. I mean, that's why Wolverine, the limited series, the Daredevil run, that's why the Dark Knight Returns, that's why that is his most notorious work. But at the same time, there are shots of Wolverine in that Wolverine limited series that, if you held it up against that Wolverine cover that's supposed to be coming out, again, the one on the thumbnail, if people don't know what I'm talking about, those are not, those don't look like they're drawn by the same capability that Frank Miller is capable of, in my opinion. And so I kind of push back on that one a little bit, just because I also, here's the other thing I want to get to when it comes to Frank Miller specifically. I have not seen him recently at a con or anything like that, but I have heard that his health may not be
right. So that's the question we're going to ask: is, does Frank Miller get a pass for being a legend? We call him out for these. We can call him out for the subpar art, but it also is someone who is really old. Like, has been doing this a long time. They don't probably have the same capability they once did. I can't, wrestle a high school wrestling match like I used to could.
It'd be fun to watch, though.
It would be, but I don't have the same capabilities I used to.
Yeah.
And so there's some of that where, if we're comparing like work, we have to compare like work to like work. And
yeah,
I think Frank Miller's current work all kind of looks that way. And if it fits the story, then it's a good use of Frank Miller's time. If it doesn't, and you're just trotting him out for being Frank Miller, that's the same as trotting out one of these guys at, these old timers at Comic Cons who can barely look up at you, but desperately need the money and don't know how to sign their own name.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, I just realized that I left Sin City off of that list, and I actually, that's a crime, and I should not have left Sin City off that list of works of his. But that brings out that lighting and shadow. His creativity in negative space, being used for shadow, is
right,
legendary. And yeah, if you don't give him that ability to do that, it's going to show. I also want to point out, when we talk about this health thing, I've seen that brought up a couple times with Frank Miller specifically. And then I see some kind of counter arguments like, yeah, but if he has health, like, why would that prevent him from drawing? One thing I want to kind of make clear, and I'm not really an artist, but I understand this pretty well from knowing people that are of that age. Your hand strength really deteriorates at a certain age, especially if you've been dealing with maybe other medical issues that he may or may not have dealt with, from what I understand. So that can really play into it.
I'll tell you this, and you take from this what you will. I'm 6'2", 300 pounds. I stood next to Frank Miller at Comics Pro last year, or not Comics Pro, at Baltimore Comic Con last year. And I felt concerned that if I breathed too hard, he would fall over. Like, man is still smart as a whip, but it's one of those, if you've ever wished for the heads from the jars from Futurama, that's kind of what you need to hope for with Frank. The body's gone, but the mind is still there.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely something that plays into artists. And Frank Miller is a perfect example. There are a few others too. And you could maybe make the argument for Liefeld at this point, but artists that have had a long career where they've gone from one level of capability, let's say that, to another. But there's also something too that really deserves to be talked about, and that is stylistic changes that an artist might incorporate into their style, and being known and loved for one style and having that morph into another style. This is something that happens with musicians and bands all the time too, where, hey, that first album, I loved it, it was so great. Well, they've done that first album. Some bands want to keep making the same music over and over and over again, and some bands want to evolve their sound, put down a different style tracks. Same thing goes for, stand-up comedians that want to evolve their type of act. A lot of types of art, right?
Right.
And so that's something to be, kind of taken into consideration too. And I think that might be a case where you could talk about John Romita Jr. a little bit. He might play into that quite a bit, actually, where his style has kind of changed over time a little bit too. And I think it's not necessarily for everybody. And for some people, they're still big fans of his.
Well, let's do this. Let's take our first break, and when we come back, I want to dive into the Rob Liefeld of it all. And that's why I want to dive into the Rob Liefeld of it all. We'll get into that when we come back, but I have kind of a hot take on Rob Liefeld and that sort of thing. So, when we come back, we'll have the phone line open. I'll give you that number right now, 567-318-6507, 1-567-318-6507 to call in. So we're going to take our first break. We'll be back right after this here on Devil's Advocates.
You just finished the last episode of your favorite news show, and you just have to talk about it. But all your friends are ghosting you because of that incident last week at the buffet. Oh, you know the one. What you did to that chowder. Ugh. Keeps me up at night. So what do? Join writer Dan Wickline as he breaks down all your favorite pop culture media. Whether it's a review of the latest nerdy TV show or a dive back into the history of your favorite comic characters, Dan's ready to discuss all the hottest topics live. Join the conversation as Dan live streams Tuesday through Thursday at 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. The Dan Wickline Show on The Experience. Comic culture and sales.
Go follow The Experience on TikTok at @the_EXP1 or scan the QR code on the screen. Our TikTok is like everywhere else we are, except you only have to deal with us for a minute. Seems like a win-win to me. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome into Devil's Advocates. I am producer Kyle. That, of course, is Bronze Age Nerd. There you go. I couldn't find my own hand there for a second. We are talking about good artists gone bad. Why are bad artists popular? Or why do popular artists sometimes do terrible things?
And when we were leaving for the break, you said you want to talk about Rob Liefeld.
I do.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you want to defend Rob Liefeld a bit?
No.
Okay, because I kind of do.
But we'll talk about that in a second. But if you want to call in with your thoughts about Rob Liefeld or anything else, 1-567-318-6507, 1-567-318-6507. You can talk to us and tell us what you think. All right, here is my stance on Rob Liefeld. Rob Liefeld is disqualified from being part of this conversation. Because the premise is why do good artists go bad? Why do good artists sometimes have bad work? And at the same time, why are bad artists popular? I would argue that Rob Liefeld, much like the legendary Rick Astley, is only popular because of the joke that is Rob Liefeld. He had a moment in the 90s where Rob Liefeld art was considered good. It wasn't. People thought Kid Rock was good at one point in his career too. So my statement is that Rob Liefeld is not good. But he did a thing at a time when that thing was what people were looking for. And so therefore, he's been able to ride that popularity to now to the point where he's become a meme. If you would like another musical analogy, he is the Steve Miller Band of comics. Only works because of the time in which it happened.
I don't know if I can agree with that completely, because where I do agree is that Rob Liefeld is not an artist who has had his style drastically change or has had a severe downgrade in his ability in arts. I agree with that kind of premise here. He's many of his pieces now are much on par with what he was putting out in the 90s. Some possibly are even a little bit better. But what I would also say is that Rob Liefeld art was not never. It wasn't often as terrible as it's made out to be by the memes. You want a musical analogy? Rob Liefeld is a little like Nickelback, where everyone loves to poop all over him. and some of that's deserved.
Right.
I'm not going to sit here and say like I love every Rob Liefeld panel I've ever watched, but I have recently reread some of the stuff from the end of the New Mutants run and some of the stuff from X-Force. And there are several panels in that body of work that are competent enough to be in a comic book. There are serious anatomy issues with what Rob Liefeld draws. But look, there are anatomy issues with pretty much every comic book artist out there. The question is, to what extent?
Right.
And where I think Liefeld gets in trouble on this discussion, where I'm not fully defending Rob Liefeld. I just think that there's a reason that there should be a little nostalgia around some of his work. It is fun to go watch.
And I would say this, that the nostalgia really is the key to that popularity. That's what I'm saying.
I agree with that.
It happened when it happened at the time when that was what everyone wanted. And it was great for that, but that doesn't mean it was good. Remember when everybody thought swing dancing was a good idea? Like, it's the same thing. But because of that, there's a special place in the hearts of nerds for it. And I'll be honest, as much people hate me for this, I lump McFarlane in there with Liefeld in that point. I don't think McFarlane's art when he was at Marvel is anywhere near as good as his recent work on Spawn. Right? The most recent stuff he's done.
Ooh, that's a good one.
At the time when he was doing what he was doing at Marvel, it was all anybody wanted. Because it was different. It was interesting. Wasn't necessarily the greatest art you've ever seen.
I think with a lot of pencilers, the problem you run into is separating the line work from the composition to a certain degree. Because some artists are better at the composition, some are better at the line work, and some are fantastic at both, right? Or it's a spectrum. And by composition, I'm talking about things like storytelling, visual storytelling, having your eyes seamlessly flow. over each individual panel and how it makes up the page, but also literally artistic composition, the use of negative space, the use of um, blocking for the different characters, those sorts of things. And I think McFarlane has his moments when it comes to that stuff. His actual detailed line work is totally competent. And I that's where I think like his line work may have gotten better, like on the recent stuff that he's done. But I think he also has more time, right? He has more time to devote to each one of those pieces.
Yeah, and that's kind of a thing that we can't really take into effect, right? As we talk about this thing, we could talk about how busy an artist or creator is, but we don't know what their deadlines are and what their project turnarounds and things are.
Yeah.
So, when we go back to Peach Momoko, we talk about, how many covers she was being tasked with, how much time he spent on each one. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's not an excuse. It's not an exemption.
Right. That's true too.
And so, like you mentioned it earlier, and we'd get to Ramita eventually. And we're getting there rather quickly. But I think part of the Ramita problem isn't that it's Ramita. I think it's Ramita without Klaus Janson or Ramita without Scott Hanna.
Yeah.
And that's something that you also can't account for in this situation, right? It's John Romita art that came out really poorly. But would that have been as poor if Scott Hanna or Klaus Janson had inked it? And I don't know who inked that piece.
Damn it. You stole my thunder. Because that I was gonna say that's the missing element in all this is talking about the inker.
Right.
It's a fantastic point. Like I said, I was definitely going to bring that up at some point here. It is when I was talking to Randy Emberlin, we're talking about the turnaround time just a second ago. He was talking about how on some of his first works he was handed, he had like a week or two to ink these. I mean, because especially back then, we're talking about stuff in the 90s. It's not like the files were sent over and you could print them off and work on them, and they were mailed to that person. Right. They had to work on it and mail it back in order to meet a deadline. And so the amount of time that the inker had to work on it, and also just the inker's interpretation of the line work and what it should look like on the finished page is a massive difference. I mean, that we've seen that in comics over and over again with artists that have had their work either ruined or magnified by the quality of the inker that's with them, or just maybe not even the quality, but the synergy that inker has with that penciler. And one of the things I mentioned Randy Emberlin. I just love the fact that he's a penciler and an inker. He's obviously known as an inker now, but he's somebody who can do pencil and line work too. And those inkers tend to do such a better job because they have more of that idea of the flow of the story, the composition, the lighting, all those different things that go into play there.
Right. Like I have Ramita Batman art on my wall right now, and it's inked by Klaus Janson, and you can see some of the eraser lines, right? Like where there were pencils that Klaus is like, no, that cape, if you do that, it's going to look terrible, and didn't, and then had to re-erase additional stuff, or white out. There's white outlines on a lot of my original art for that kind of reason. And it's the difference of, I think, really, some of this really does come down to who is your partner.
Yeah.
Is the script descriptive enough and giving you enough to work with to be able to draw a good picture?
Right.
Is the inker then taking the line work that you've done and interpreting it correctly? And even then, and this is one of my favorites, is then when they render the file into printable format, is the computer being your friend? Like how bad is it? Often, how often do you hear comic books being recalled because there was a printing error where it didn't color correct?
Yeah. Right.
Because it's not a Pantone color, so it's hard to translate. Now the color's off, and you have Hulk being purple instead of green.
Right.
There's so much that goes into this. So when we talk about good artists gone bad, or why do sometimes bad work come out? I think we have to always remember in any of these situations, to get any art out at all is no small feat.
It's very true. And I mean,
That's
and
very frank.
you could also add in, the colorist kind of comes into play as well. It's a team effort, but I think where you do start to be able to analyze this, I mean, it doesn't completely obfuscate the art, because we do have, on some of these artists we're talking about in this discussion, a huge body of work of theirs where, regardless of who they worked with, we still see these common issues with posing or anatomy. And one of the things I kind of want to go back just a little bit to the Rob Liefeld discussion. Bless you. Because when it comes to Rob Liefeld, and I was talking about the Nickelback, I was talking about the meme aspect. What the thing is, pouches and feet, right?
Right.
Let's talk about feet for a second, because
Can I make a joke real fast?
of course.
I was in a meeting. Jay was in this meeting. We were talking about an event that I have to go to where I have to dress business casual. And I remarked that I was overdressed last year. And I go, I'll probably wear khakis this year. And I go, maybe even Rob Liefeld khakis, which are khakis with pouches.
Oh man, I love it.
From now on, cargo pants, if you're of the dad ilk where you wear cargo pants still, Rob Liefeld khakis. That's the new name. Headcanon accepted.
I love it. Liefeld pants, man. That's good. When it comes to the feet thing, I just want to address that real fast. You can find a lot of examples from a lot of artists where they have avoided drawing hands or feet, because many pencilers do not like drawing them because they take extra time, or they're not as good at drawing hands or feet as they are other parts of the body. There's actually a Tony Daniel solicitation that just came out for, I'm pretty sure it's a Venom cover, where Venom has like this giant elephant foot, a lot like what you'd see like on some of the Rob Liefeld type stuff. And Tony Daniel is a very competent penciler, so it's probably a situation where one of those factors came into play. But it's not just stuff like that. I mean, you look at any artist, another good example of mine, Mike Deodato Jr. was really popular for a good stretch of time, and still is in some cases. But some of his stuff from the 90s, if you look at it, it's pretty clear to see that some of the issues that people have with Rob Liefeld, like legs being too long or feet being drawn awkwardly, like that's an artist that I see some of those same issues with, and is often given a pass in a different way. Like people just don't talk about those artists in the same way. Right. But it is something that you definitely have to consider, is that a lot of artists don't like drawing this stuff. Now, Rob Liefeld probably takes that to an extreme, but also all eyeballs are on his work every single time that a piece comes out to see whether or not, is he drawing the feet? Are they there? If they are there, what do they look like?
And I think some of that he's brought on himself.
Sure. Yeah, that's the other thing
about himself. And good on you for knowing your shortcomings.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't at all fault him for that. When the joke made the Deadpool movie, I knew it had reached critical mass. But there are things that people hate to draw, and then there are artists who relish that and who do such great work at it. And I think not being able to draw it, or shying away from drawing it, or doing when you're forced to draw something you don't like to draw and you do a lackadaisical job at it, I think that's the point. Like, you gotta draw it. I don't care if you don't like it.
Yeah.
If you're not willing to put in the effort, then why? Like, I couldn't draw hands if you paid me. I couldn't draw hands if you paid John Romita to draw hands for me, John Romita Jr. I still couldn't draw hands. But if I get a job where I'm drawing a comic and I have to draw hands, I've got to spend as much time as it takes to figure it out. And my inability to do that is my cost. I shouldn't rush through it and just kind of find a way around it, because otherwise my hourly rate would go down. No. You've got to do the work. Otherwise, you open yourself up for this kind of ridicule. And
Yeah.
if it's worth it to you, then fine. But it wouldn't be worth it to me.
Yeah, and a lot of feet is a really common, and hands are a common complaint I see. Another one that I'd recommend people look at is look at backgrounds. And you'll often find that artists that are taking shortcuts or press for time, often there's not much going on in those backgrounds. It might just be a solid color, and you kind of expect that on most comic books. You'll kind of see that from time to time. But if you're looking at a whole page and all of a sudden you realize there's no backgrounds, or you get a lot of that blurred effect with very little detail, that could be another sign of that happening too. And yeah, it's like, hey man, you want to draw comic books? This is the job. I forgive to a certain extent that there may be extenuating external factors that are kind of on somebody, like maybe they're doing 2 books at once, or they got asked to fill in and there's almost no time left. But if somebody's on a monthly title and you're starting to see those kinds of issues, yeah, absolutely, you got to question that.
Well, that's one of those things is that I make fun of Gary Frank a lot, because the man has never turned in a book on time in a day in his life. But you know what? When you look at his art, you don't see the problems. You see with other people. There's something to be said for working your pace.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not on time, so what? Right? When you're a new up-and-comer just trying to make your name, you can't do that. But by the time your name is spoken of in the level where you make our list for this conversation, you have the clout to be able to say, you know what? I'm going to be late. What are you going to do? Fire me? Like, really? We're in the middle of this book and you're going to let go a legend? No. So I think that's part of it too. Like, sometimes you have to sacrifice being on time for being good, and retailers don't love that. Retailers hate that. In fact, 100%. I'm still angry about Doomsday Clock for that. But when you're an artist, you have to be responsible for the art. You can't necessarily be responsible for making people happy.
Moving on a little bit from Liefeld, I want to get back to Preston's comment here. I'll have to say Momoko is uneven to me. That Black Panther charcoal painting cover is one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. But her covers for Alien and Carnage makes me wonder why she did it. And Preston, you may have missed what I said earlier about Peach Momoko, because I think it's along similar lines. That it's kind of, for me, she is one of those artists that when she's at the top of her game, I heavily enjoy her work, like the Black Panther you're talking about. However, a lot of her work, I just don't know what's going on. That Carnage one is a good example. A few others where I'm like, I don't even understand what's going on here. And I fully admit too, her style is not a style that I'm immediately drawn to. I think that I'm literally just lazy enough. My eye is, and I mean like literally, and lazy eye as in like you'll be drawn to colors or not. Her stuff is so desaturated, generally speaking, that I think I just sort of wash over it. But yeah, it's a tough style for me to fall into. But when she does do it right, I think it's amazing. So I would agree with your comment. It is uneven.
Uneven is definitely the word. Like, one of the things I look for in artists that I would consider good artists is consistency. And if you don't have the consistency, then you've got a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that kind of, we talked about Eastman earlier. That's kind of, Eastman's a very consistent artist.
Right. And that's why I don't understand a person like Kevin Eastman being on the list. And here's part of that, right? It's the same art regardless of what it is. Kevin Eastman standing in front of you drawing a sketch cover at a convention is going to be the same as what Kevin Eastman puts on the page for a Turtles book or anything else. It's when you see a piece of Kevin Eastman art and go, that doesn't work, it's because someone has hired Kevin Eastman to do something they shouldn't have hired Kevin Eastman to do. Right?
Yeah.
And that's me saying, I don't know why anyone would hire Kevin to do anything that isn't anthropomorphized animals.
In a grungy city backdrop.
Right, in a grunge with grunge. You're right. It's like you don't hire Kevin Eastman to draw Superman. It just doesn't work. So that's one of those. Is it's a specific artist, and I think, and that's something we'll talk about here in the last few minutes, I suppose. But I have a question I wanted to ask as it goes to this, but I think artists are all very specific. Every artist you see has their own style because, or at least in the modern era, there was a time where everybody at Marvel had to look like, the Marvel house style.
Yeah. Marvel
There's
method.
time at DC, that everybody had to look like that. But by and large, that's gone away. And so artists are so very specific that I think part of the reason that bad art exists is because artists are misused. Not because the art is bad, but because that artist has done their absolute level best at something they aren't good at. Ask Chris and I to do the Nutcracker, and you'll see what I mean. We'll try our level best, but ain't nobody gonna go. Everybody's gonna be in therapy after.
Speak for yourself. I'd kill it. Yeah, and I think the style and the way that artist is used often is something that I think is definitely going to come into play here for the last segment on the show, because there's some artists I want to talk about too that I often hear talked about as bad artists, and in fact, most of the cases of the ones I'm going to bring up, they're artists that I actually really enjoy. But as I've gotten older in my life, as I've gotten older and farther along in my life, I'm willing to look at it through a different lens more and see, okay, I see what you're talking about. Even if I don't agree with it, I can see where, maybe the anatomy issues of this artist or the whatever of this artist is something that I can't unlike myself, but I can see where somebody else could. And that is kind of one of those things where I think we're going to talk about a few of those people here coming up. And Eastman is a really good example of that, where there's some people that just don't like Eastman's art.
Right.
They're out there. And some other names, just so Kevin Eastman doesn't feel lonely, some other names I'll throw out there that come to mind for me for this are J. Scott Campbell, Trad Moore, Mike Mignola, and you could probably throw Milo Manara in there as well, although he's not primarily a comic book artist. His art is critiqued for various reasons. But when it comes to each of these artists, there is kind of like almost this knee-jerk reaction to anytime I see some of their work shared or announced. And I think a fun one to talk about is J. Scott Campbell, because J. Scott Campbell can sell books. He gets hired to do, variant covers, and those books will always sell. But when it comes to J. Scott Campbell, you hear the same criticisms over and over and over.
Yep.
He is using the same pose over and over and over. He is drawing the same figure over and over and over. He's drawing his wife over and over and over.
Break her back.
Exactly. And I think the reason J. Scott Campbell is a fun one to talk about with this is because of that. Because I should point that way. Because he famously, or infamously, I guess would be the right word, was called out by somebody for his art, and that went very viral.
Yep.
If you don't know what I'm talking about, the ASM 601 cover with Mary Jane was criticized by somebody who's not even, as far as I'm aware, not really an artist, but they tried to fix his art. And I thought the reaction to that was pretty interesting, because at first, when I read through everything that was going on, J. Scott Campbell comes out and defends his art, which, hey, props to you. You're defending your art. Maybe some of those comments came across as a little petty or a little snipish when some of his retorts and how they were coming across. But what I'll give him props for is he did two things I really respect. One is he did an updated version of that piece. And I'll tell you, I'm a big fan of J. Scott Campbell in general, although I do agree with the criticism that he does the same stuff over and over and over again. I like to see his originality kind of shine through a little bit more. I love that cover. That's a comic book that is very prized in my collection because I think it's a very cool cover, and I like some of the history around it, which is the story. But he did this updated fixed piece for that ASM 601 cover, and out of the original, the one that the artist criticized and fixed for him, and that fixed one, his J. Scott Campbell's fixed one is my favorite of the three.
Well, and there's something to be talked about here too. With, you brought it up earlier, and I don't even know how to put it in a way that really is going to be succinct, but it's stylistic change.
Yeah.
The best version of Neil Gaiman's American Gods is the 10-year anniversary artist preferred texts, because Neil Gaiman went back and fixed things that he always thought he got wrong, added things he left out because his publisher wanted it left out because of the politics of the time, did all these kind of things, and it makes the story so much more well-rounded.
Yeah.
There's something to be said for artists' change. J. Scott Campbell at 35 is not J. Scott Campbell at 45, is not J. Scott Campbell at 50.
Yeah.
Stuff happens and his art changes. And what happens then is the subjectivity that is, I like this person's art at this moment, becomes, oh, when did they get bad? When in fact they didn't, they just changed. You just don't like it.
Yep.
And I will say I've seen that with some artists that I've followed for long periods of time in the industry, where it's, oh, I could see the style changing here. Oh, this book is very different. Oh, this book is even more different. And it kind of can throw you off, but you have to remember that maybe it's you, maybe it's them. Right? You may not have changed what you like, but what they've changed how they want to draw.
Yeah.
I am not, as we talked a few weeks ago in our wildly popular War on Adult Comics, I'm not a big fan of Cheesecake.
Yeah.
I'm just not. But the new J. Scott Campbell stuff that is a little more realistic, that is a little less, that's not how a spine bends, is really beautiful. And I'm great. Arthur Adams is a great example. Arthur Adams has changed a bunch of different ways. And I think some of it is good and some of it is just different, and I'm going to have to learn to love it. But Arthur Adams is one that, that I can see as my time following Arthur Adams.
Yeah. And he's definitely one too, where I actually think there will be a lot of people that prefer his older stuff. And I actually think there'll be a lot of people that prefer his newer stuff.
Right.
And that's a fantastic example, because for me, I tend to prefer the older stuff as far as his literal line work, because it was a little bit more detailed. However, I think that his posing composition has gotten better as he's gotten older. Maybe he just knows his audience a little bit more. But that's a really good example. I do want to, just because I wasn't totally done writing the book on J. Scott Campbell and his redemption arc there, I didn't like originally how he handled that issue. I did like the fixed art. I just thought he came across as being maybe like, this is one of those things where you kind of Barbara Streisand affected a little bit. Like, you're bringing it up and you're kind of giving it some power, right? And I would have preferred him to see him not address that. But this is where I give him real props. He turned that into a campaign that itself went viral, where he said, hey, you draw it. Anybody out there, you draw it, hashtag it. I can't remember what the hashtag is now. It was a few years ago. That fixed the art or something like that. And people were drawing, I think it was 603, the Black Cat piece he did. He put that out there and said, hey, here's another one that is kind of in those same lines. I want to see what you guys come up with. And people produced some really awesome artwork that came out of that. And I think it got people talking about what we're talking about today, and talking about, the styles of artists and how they've changed and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. And ultimately, as you see me come back to over and over and again, that anytime you get people talking, engaging, sharing their opinions and coming to a common ground or having that discourse, that's good for comics. That's good for furthering what we enjoy about comic books. Takes us back to, having those little arguments in the LCS over who'd beat who, or which artist did it better, or who handled, this particular situation the best. And I think that's a really cool thing that I was very glad to see come from all that. And it's really nice to see artists that are willing to talk about this with their own art, talk about those flaws and mistakes. You could go back a little bit to Rob Liefeld, who was kind of infamously almost on the other side, where if you come in making fun of his artwork to his live streams or something like that, you're going to get booted and banned or whatever from whatever stream he's on.
Yeah, so. No. So, I mean, are you good to stay a little long tonight?
I can stay a little bit long. My wife will kill me if I don't get her food in somewhat soon of a time frame.
So there's one last thing I want to talk about, and it goes back to the Rob Liefeld thing. And then I kind of want to talk about Mike Mignola just a little.
100%. Let's do it.
So my question is it still stealing if you steal from yourself? So, and it kind of falls into that J. Scott Campbell, Rob Liefeld thing. How many times has Rob Liefeld repurposed New Mutants 98 for a book that he wants to launch at Image? Like, how many times? Or how many times has J. Scott Campbell drawn a girl like this? Like, if you keep stealing from yourself, is it still stealing? And if you have to keep going back to that same well that is your biggest hit over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, are you actually successful? Right? It's,
yeah.
And to make that music analogy, there are bands that people say, well, they're one trick ponies, where all of their songs are kind of the same formula, like a band like AC/DC or something like that. And I would argue that the only way you know it's formula is that those artists did something, or those creators or musicians or whoever did something that is not formula to compare it to. So
true. There's another part of that too, though, which is the only reason those examples are popular enough to talk about is because they are popular. And so if everybody comes to J. Scott Campbell and says, I want you to draw this female character in, your style that you're famous for this variant cover, are you encouraging J. Scott Campbell to try new stuff? I think another really good example that would be along those lines would be Adam Hughes. For a long time, Adam Hughes was doing very similar work. And I would say about 3 years ago, you started to see him do some different stuff, some really innovative stuff for his style. I don't know what caused that, but it sure made a difference. People started talking about Adam Hughes in a way I hadn't heard him talked about in probably 10 years when some of those covers came out that he was working on. And I get that, to me, I guess that's where I land on it is, if that popular musician is putting out music that people keep buying, is their audience incentivizing them to try something different?
Yeah. Like I said, I think that's the other part of it. Like, and I just, Rob Liefeld has essentially stolen from himself so many times. How do we quantify that in this argument?
Yeah.
So the last thing I think that I want to kind of talk about is Mike Mignola.
Sure.
And when I say I want to talk about Mike Mignola, I don't mean specifically Mike Mignola. I mean, you named off a bunch of them. Mike Mignola, Tradmore. I would throw Keith Giffen into there, into that row, that pile as well. But artists who what they do is so specific that it would be considered bad were it anything other than what they do.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about. I have to hold Keith Giffen and Mike Mignola in different categories in that same box. I don't know that Keith Giffen's art would ever speak to me. It just isn't my jam. Whereas Mike Mignola is one of those that I often find myself saying, is this Mike Mignola doing a bad Mike Mignola impression? He's someone who I think his style has changed and has, in my opinion, gotten worse.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to quantify the difference, though, because there are people who would disagree with me on Mignola, and they'd be right, same as I'm right. And there's people who disagree with me on Keith Giffen, and they'd be right, same as I'm right. So I don't know how to really quantify it in that regard with those artists. But what do you say to somebody who, throws a name out there in this, when you talk about these artists that are just specific and divisive that way?
Yeah, it's a lot of, it's funny. When I kind of came up with the idea for this show, it's something that's kind of been on my mind, and I threw it out there. It started off with, the Rob Liefelds and because of that Frank Miller drawing, and if you start to really examine what it is about this idea of popular artists that people have strong opinions on, that's the nicest way I could really put it, with some of their work, it really does start to boil down to, you start talking to that giant list of second tier people that get brought up in these conversations, where it's pretty obvious that it's, oh, well, you just don't like their style, or you don't like their work. And that is totally fine. The world would be a very boring place if, I see Preston's comment here, talking about Todd Knock and Scotty Young's chibi covers and stuff like that. If there are people that love and buy each of those, and there are people that hate and will never touch either of those. So it's very polarizing is the word for that, right? So when it comes to that style, like people that read Silver Surfer Black, it was very polarizing. People loved it or people hated it because of in large part because of Tradmore's artwork. And for me, I was a fan of it because it's different, it's interesting. It's something that I like to wrap my head around, because it deals cosmic Marvel art, to me, in a lot of ways should be kind of trippy. Like, that's when it's at its best. So that played right into that for me. But at the same time, there are people out there that just bounce right off that, because they only like, people from that Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Brett Booth, like very detailed style of comic book art. Or, I mentioned Tony Daniel earlier. He'd fit right into that. But there's room for everything. But, everybody gets to have their preference, right? Like, that's what it ultimately comes down to for me, is it's okay to say you don't like, John Romita Jr. It's okay to say you don't like that artwork. But when you start to talk about styles, that's where it's really going to get tough for people, because some of those books, I would say, like, the style is so intrinsic to the story, it's so intrinsic to that character or whatever that's being developed, that it's hard to separate the two. Like it's a little tough because Frank Miller wrote and drew Sin City, but think about Sin City with a different artist delivering the work and Frank Miller writing it. Like, it's just not going to be the same. Hellboy without Mike Mignola. What's that?
Ironically, Sin City, the next volume of Sin City is drawn by Milo Manara.
I did not know that. That is fantastic. Wow. I can't wait to see that now.
I know. I'm pretty excited. I'll be honest.
Yeah. Oh man, you know what? This is one of those ones that I absolutely kick myself for not mentioning earlier in the show, and I really appreciate you bringing this comment up, because we said, maybe technology changes. We didn't even talk about digital versus traditional artists and the line between those, which, I mean, honestly might be a great topic for another show too, at some point
next week.
We might do that. I think there's also something I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and something you might see over on my channel a little bit too, is some of the discussions around digital art and the use of AI combined with digital art. So there might be some definite things to talk about there, but I really appreciate bringing up that comment. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, I think that's next week.
Yeah,
is a digital versus traditional art. And how do we feel about how it affects people's style?
Yeah. Yep. And the people that do Shades of Gray, like, they start doing traditional line work, and then they, it's heavily colorized by digital, all those different things. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, like I said, it's I really want to just kind of have this talk about specific styles of Mignola and some of these people who if anybody else draws Hellboy, they have to draw it to look like Mike Mignola drew it. That it's just the nature of the character. So it's this, it's this bigger concept of, your style matters more than the work. And I think a lot of times what we consider bad is just different.
Yeah.
And, or someone tried something and maybe they hired the wrong artist. So,
the I don't know where to fit this into the conversation we've had, the greater conversation here. But the other thing that is such a part of this to me is, think about how much we talk about covers when it comes to this.
Right.
It's a huge part of the conversation. But when we talk about interior art, I don't know that people have less opinions about it, but it seems to be discussed less. And I don't really know how to work this into the topic at large here, but having that, stark contrast between a cover image and the interior art, or having very weak interior art by an artist that is capable of better work, and maybe they even drew a fantastic cover that got you into that book, and then you open it and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on in here?
Well, ironically, that's the Todd Knox situation.
Yeah. Those headshot covers.
Todd became a cover artist because he did covers so well. And then when he would do interiors, because he was so used to doing covers, his interiors suffered, even though early on in his career, he was an interior artist who was great.
Yeah.
So it's one of those kind of situations where sometimes not only does technology change, does style change, does age change, but situation changes.
Here's a direct question, so I will give you my answer to this, which is, I am woefully unfamiliar with manga, so I can only give you probably what is considered a terrible answer. But I am a big fan of somebody who is heavily manga inspired, and that is Adam Warren. I really like Adam Warren's work on, originally Gen 13 is kind of where I'm most familiar with him, but the book he did, Empowered, where I think his art is fantastic. And sometimes I don't even like the material inside Empowered, but just his artwork and the detail behind it will draw me in. But I am always taking recommendations on manga to read, because I need to get more familiar with it. And I'm reading Berserk right now, because that is kind of wildly what is recommended to me the most. So I've started reading that, but it is like a different world for me, and I keep trying to get into it. But that's my answer.
Junji Ito and Venus in the Blind Spot maybe is the best work of his, in my opinion. Uzumaki's right there, of course, but Junji Ito is my answer.
Cool. Appreciate the question. We do love getting those direct questions for sure. But yeah, I think that, where you have to kind of land on this is really ask yourself, are you mad at the artist? Are you mad at how they were chosen for that work as opposed to a different artist? Are you mad at the style and interpretation they took on that art? Mad, you could place that with, not interested, disgusted, not buying, any of those kinds of terms. And is that fair? Is it really something that they should have been chosen to do? Is it something that matches with their normal style? Is it something that can conflicts with that? And I think that's kind of it. I mean, really, when it comes to styles, you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it most of the time. But that can also change based on the context, based on what story is being told for some people. And for some people, they're only going to like certain types of art over and over and over again, and that's all they want to see, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the beauty of comics, is there's plenty out there. And the advice that I always give when it comes to stuff like this is, if you like art, make sure you're out there supporting it. If you really like a certain artist, not just the cover, although that is an important factor, but also the interior art. And of course, this goes for everything else in the comic book too, but make sure you're out there supporting it, buying it at your local comic shop if you can, ordering online if you have to, buying the digital copies if it comes down to that, or that's what you prefer, because that is how you're going to convince people that this is somebody who sells. And we've seen over and over and over again, if the comic book sells and it's believed to be in large part due to the artwork, that artist is going to get more work in the future.
Yep.
Cool.
I don't really have anything to add to that other than no one can ever tell me that John Romita Jr. did bad art, and no one can ever tell me that Kevin Eastman did bad art.
Fair enough.
My fangirl eyes will not accept it.
No one will ever be able to make me read a John Romita Jr. Drawn book and not roll my eyes at some of the art.
That's normal.
All right. Well, we really appreciate everybody being a part of this conversation. We do want to remind you that we would, we talked about what our topic's probably going to be for next week. Whenever we announce on the show, by the way, if some big thing comes up, we might pivot to that topic to make sure that we're staying current with the times. But at the same token, we love to hear your suggestions for future show topics. We even have on the EXP website a place where you can go do that, to go recommend and suggest your suggestions for our topics. And if you decide that you want to call into the show at any point, we would absolutely love to hear from you. We love having those conversations. Try to view this as in large part inspired by like a radio talk show where we want you to come on and to be able to talk about these topics. So if you see that, next topic coming up, have a question prepared and feel free to give us a buzz when we open up the phone line in the show. That said, we do absolutely appreciate you being here for this discussion and being in chat. And to those watching on the rewind, we appreciate you being here as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to catch all of our shows here on the EXP.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.